Welcome to this edition of Cranmer Readings, I should say. We're with Professor McCulloch, and last time we were discussing the complex relationships, which is explored by Prof. McCulloch, leading up to the prebendaries plot. The names are given: prebendary Gardiner, Dr. London, Dr. Willoughby, Robert Searles, and others, including Wiley Winchester. Back-channeling and communications and gossip and stories are circulating. Cranmer's evangelical staff and the courtiers are aware and hear this, that, and the other of the moves, the complaints, the players, including Cranmer's secretary, Roger Maurice. Christopher Nevinson, an evangelical protege of Cranmer and evangelical in Kent, is stirring the pot, and that's not lost on the contentious bilateral conflicts in Canterbury Cathedral. Neither side was passive, and both sides had their leaders. This was a dumpster fire that would grow into a forest fire. And the leading question in the climax of the plot will come in 1543 with Henry intervening. The evangelicals were not passive under fire as the conservatives launched their assault. It can be no coincidence that after Passion Sunday, 1543, Nevinson affirmed his confidence in Bland by resigning to him his prebend in Edmund Cranmer's Wingham College. Bland celebrated by a further outrageous sermon on the superstitious ceremonies of Palm Sunday, 18 March, a major occasion for such ceremonies. We should also recall Nevinson's pointed gesture in inviting the stormy petrel of the Windsor troubles, Anthony Pearson, to preach in Canterbury the same day. Ralph Maurice also sprang into action in defense of Turner. At this stage, Turner's prospects do not seem to have been too menacing. A date was appointed for Cranmer himself to head a set of commissioners to hear the parson of Chartham's case at Lambeth after Easter. Maurice went further in short-circuiting the procedure, directly intervening with Sir Thomas Moyle to let Turner preach a couple of trial sermons at Moyle's parish church at Westall on Wednesday in Easter week, 28 March, and for the moment Moyle pronounced himself satisfied. Moyle was one weak link in the Conservatives' plans, either simply because he was fair-minded or because he was too preoccupied as the Speaker of the House of Commons. It was he who had been responsible for leaking complaints about the evangelical clergy to Cranmer after Passion Sunday. The priming of the enemy camp might endanger the broad sweep of London's plans to link up his Windsor complaints with those of Kent before the council. For now, Turner, having provided fuel for the flames, was small fry compared with the possible range of victims. The first was Simon Haynes, now Dean of Exeter, but more to the point, Dr. London's long-standing enemy as former Dean of Windsor, who on 15 March was abruptly summoned up to the Privy Council. The following day, Haynes appeared before the council. The day after that, the courtier Thomas Weldon appeared on charges of favoring Anthony Pearson. Dr. London noted with glee on 18 Hi, Mary. Good afternoon. Cranmer, yay. Which book are you reading? Came in a minute just after you started. I'm reading Dermot McCulloch. That's how you say his first name, but it's spelled D-I. It's spelled differently than it sounds. It's Dermot, D-I-A-R-M-A-I-D. It sounds like D.R. Maid, but it's Dermot McCulloch, M-A-C-C-U-L-L-O-C. He's probably the premier scholar on Cranmer, and we're going to be reading him for years. He's a Church of England man, third generation Church of England. Dr. London noted with glee on March 18, 1543, how well his plan had worked so far. The king was astonished and wondered, angry both with the doers and bearers of these Windsor evangelicals. That's evangelicals at Windsor Castle, where Queen Elizabeth II is buried, where Henry VIII and his wife, Catherine Seymour, his third wife, are buried. Yet events were not completely spinning out of evangelical control. I've got bilateral conflicts at Windsor, bilateral contests down in Canterbury and some local parish churches. Cranmer was present at the council board for all of the Windsor interviews. He was armed with the knowledge of the Kentish complaints which Moyle had passed on to him. This was no doubt why Turner was, for the moment, given the prospect of a sympathetic hearing at Lambeth Palace, which is south on the Thames, maybe 1,000 feet to the west of Parliament buildings, and across the river is Westminster Abbey. Lambeth Palace was the London residence of the Archbishops of Canterbury, still is. Yet there was more to come. On the day of Weldon's appearance, 17 March, Dr. London was standing outside the council door with his fellow Windsor prebendary of the Dean of Whitfield, Henry Williams, ready to act as a principal witness in the Windsor affair. One of the Calvinists at Windsor Castle was the leading organist who was studying and following the theological currents of the day. He survived, he kept his head down, survived Henry, Mary, and then on into Queen Elizabeth's time when he was able to be more overt. There are two deans, spotted Searles, who had ridden up from Dr. Willoughby from Kent that day. You could never come in a better season, Dr. London exclaimed in pleasure on seeing him before being swept away by someone else. Dr. London and Robert Searles, two of the anti-Cranmerians, later claimed that this meeting was accidental. But as Dr. Redworth comments, he's the famous biographer of Stephen Gardiner, this strains credulity. Behind all of this was Bishop Steve Gardiner of Winchester, otherwise known as Wily Winchester. Bishop Gardiner carefully noting all the possibilities that he could for discrediting evangelicals. One of those accused before the council was one of his diocesan clergy from Brentworth in Hampshire, and the scribe working with Dr. London in his negotiations. See, the complex personnel are coordinating. with his negotiations with the Canterbury clergy was the bishop's nephew, Germain Gardiner, nephew of Stephen. Moreover, in the final form of the surviving evidence of the affair, the need for discretion, secrecy, and reconciliation when all the maneuvering was over meant that Gardiner's role was obscured, but one heavily scored out of the question, for Dr. Willoughby originally asked whether he had said to anyone that the Bishop of Winchester would give £6,000 to pluck down the Archbishop of Canterbury. The next day, Palm Sunday, 1543, when the council passed on with its roundup of courtiers and the Windsor evangelicals, Robert Searles had a couple of meetings with Dr. London. One needs to remember that many senior churchmen were milling around London and Westminster in the wake of Convocation's prorogation, and there must have been an atmosphere of frenzied gossip about what would happen next in religious politics. And of course, Henry is flipping and flopping, not making it easy. He felt that he could maintain unity by pacifying both sides. Thus, it was noticeable that another prominent conservative theologian and Robert Searle's former colleague at Merton College, Dr. William Trencham, was sufficiently aware of what was going on to tell Robert Searles that morning that Dr. London was looking for him around Westminster. At the second meeting of the day, Searles took Dr. Willoughby along to meet the deans of London and Williams. Now the Kentish pair began to reveal their drawbacks as co-conspirators. Throughout the entire year, it was the Kentish component which let down the plans through hesitancy and indecision. It took a great deal of threatening from Dr. London to get Dr. Willoughby to agree to go to the council at all. And Dr. London had to rewrite the articles that Searles had prepared that lunchtime in order to heighten the drama of their content. Having succeeded, the Dean of Osney immediately sent this altered copy over to Bishop Gardiner. And yet this set of articles contained nothing against Cranmer. It was fairly stale stuff against lesser Kentish figures. Searles himself was too nervous after the 1541 trauma to take any further part. He was, after all, still on bail from that incident. And on Monday, he retreated to the comparative column of Oxford for the next month and a half. At this point, the sheer scale of the London, Gardiner, Kent enterprise began to get in the way of progress. It took 2 days during Holy Week before Bishop Gardiner was free enough of other business to see Dr. Willoughby, and the nearest that the increasingly nervous parson of Chilham got to council was to present his articles at the council door to the Privy Seal, Lord Russell, who brusquely noted that they were not signed and told him to get back to Canterbury to produce a proper set. The prebendary, that would be Gardiner, I guess, reported that had some encouragement at this stage from Bishop Gardiner's associate and fellow councillor, Sir Anthony Browne. Nevertheless, with a heavy heart and savage rebukes from Dr. London for his inefficiency in getting ringing in his ears, Willoughby rode back to Chilham in Canterbury on Good Friday. So far, nothing was settled, and no commission, according to the list proposed by Searles, to examine Kentish heretics It had not yet been granted. On Easter Eve, 24 March, Dr. Willoughby rode into Canterbury to meet the conservative clergy. And here, for the first time, if we're to believe him, he found a new set of articles prepared by Prebendary, Gardiner, and Searles, which was the first of a series drawn up over the next few days, listing Cranmer's misdeeds that went back to the year 1541. The Kent accusations now reached a higher target than anyone previously. Prebendary Gardiner's Easter Day sermon in Canterbury Cathedral was a stormy, dramatic affair. Now, again, there's bilateral. They're flaming each other on both sides. And any little miscue, any little miss this, that, or the other was magnified, in which he mixed up accusations of Anabaptism with attacks on those who criticized the cult of Mary and the role of confession. From the pulpit, his shrieks of heretics, faggots, it's not what we think. Faggot was used for a log, for a fire. Heretics, faggots, and fire echoed around that great building. It was a declaration of war from the pulpit against the evangelicals and Archbishop Cranmer. On 29 March, Dr. Willoughby bore his augmented ammunition back up to the capital and to Dr. London, who saw that he had finally struck gold. Throughout April, the council was shifting its attention from the Windsor issues to the capital, chasing up evangelical London printers and prominent people who had been breaking the regulations about eating flesh in Lent. At long last and predictably, the council also saw the Kent articles, probably on 22 April 1543. The day's council meeting, Cranmer was absent, but Stephen Gardiner was present, was crammed with business, most of which was bad news for the evangelicals. Among the items on the agenda were the fates of two old associates from Calais, associates of Cranmer, his former commissary John Butler, to be examined, and poor Adam Damplip, again, now to be executed. Besides this, articles were exhibited against Dean Haynes of Exeter Cathedral, that's my ancestral homeland, and given to a committee including Sir John Baker. And it's not at all implausible, in view of what happened next, that at the same time, the articles against Cranmer, too confidential to be noted in the council minute book, were entrusted to Baker. Further complaints seem to have been made to the council by Dr. London about the conduct of preachers in Cranmer's London peculiar churches, and also about Dr. Toller, probably Bishop Latimer's former diocesan official, now in Cranmer's service, Dr. Rowland Taylor. Dr. Rowland Taylor will be one of the first of the Marian victims to be burned at the stake. Moving letter by Dr. Rowland Taylor to his wife and children. That's 10 years later, 10 to 11 years later. The king himself saw these articles against Cranmer, probably on the same night. Now, in his latter words, he could see who was the biggest and greatest heretic in Kent. We'll pick that up again. The events of April 1543. We turn now with Dr. Jaspar Ridley. I believe he's a descendant of Nicholas Ridley, another man who got burned at the stake. We're in a different time period. We're 1548-ish, 1549. Jaspar Ridley, Thomas Cranmer, and there's some confusions here. One continues to hear from Ridley about Cranmer's probably big mistake in publishing a full-throated Lutheran catechism written by Justice Jonas of Augsburg. And Cranmer seeks the royal imprimatur for its publication. It's full-throated Lutheranism on the Eucharist, including 3 sacraments: baptism, Holy Communion, and confession. The conservatives spotted it for what it was, that it was closer on the Eucharist question than the Reformed. And then the Reformers in London and elsewhere saw it for what it was, a retreat on the Eucharistic question. Was it a tap dance? The conservatives and traditionalists thought it was. Bullinger is getting reports that Cranmer is rather lukewarm on Reformation, but Bullinger continues to see from his city of Zurich that England would be a great help and aid in the larger Reformation. Jaspar Ridley throws around very easily the term Zwinglian, it's kind of a theological curse word, and seems himself inclined to the bone cruncher view. But this much, despite this mistaken publication by Cranmer silences and stuns everybody with his oration, 14 to 18 December 1548, in the House of Lords, in the Parliament. Away with Roman transubstantiation, away with Lutheran consubstantiation, and in with the Reformed view that Jesus ascended to heaven and is there locally in his body, and yet is omnipresent by his divine nature, so that in the communion Christ's body doesn't jump back into the elements where we eat the bones and the elbows and the ankles, but he remains perfectly and powerfully and omnipotently at God's right hand as our Lord and Redeemer. For us, that's inarguable, and there's many witnesses to that public statement or lengthy debate held precisely and academically with great academic force by Cranmer, where he shows what his true colors are. And Jaspar Ridley thinks John Lasco, the Polish reformer, emigrant from Emden to London and has a church in London of Polish Reformed, he thinks that Lasco was a great influence, but Cranmer will later attribute that to the influence of the Bishop of London, Nicholas Ridley, and then I would add Peter Vermiglia, the martyr. So that's what we did last time, and we're in the chapter on the Book of Common Prayer, which we're coming up to 1549. Olmus's letter. Olmus is a Swiss churchman studying in England. Olmus's letter, that would be to Bullinger in Zurich, is evidence to support the theory of Cranmer's conversion was due to John Lasco, and it's not of great value. Olmus spent much of his time traveling to London to hear gossip about current politics. What was new about that? When he ought to have been studying at Oxford. but his information was often wrong. He was not in a good position to know the facts about the change in Cranmer's position on the Eucharist. But we do not have to rely on any Zwinglian spy writer to realize that the opinions on the Eucharistic presence which Cranmer put forward in the House of Lords in December 1548 were very different from those which he had expressed in the Catechism in June. I disagree with Ridley here. Something has led him to change his attitude during the autumn of 1548 and to express openly the doctrine of the Eucharist which Nicholas Ridley had converted him 2 years ago. Nicholas Ridley came to the Reformed faith through the works of Berto, of Corby, I forget the century, I want to say the 10th century, and also John Wycliffe. The arguments, Alasco may have played their part, but the true explanation is probably found in Bartholomew Treherron's letters. Treherron wrote that the nobility has become Zwinglian, just say reform, and were regarding Cranmer as lukewarm. It would be a great oversimplification to state that Cranmer changed his opinions on the presence in order to please the nobles, who had instinctively realized they would be the beneficiaries of any doctrine which weakened the authority of the church and the priesthood. But when Somerset, Warwick, Dorset, and Northampton were prepared to denounce the real presence, Cranmer could follow suit without fearing that he was encouraging heretical artisans. That's an important observation. Cranmer was a very astute fellow and could follow currents. So there's a political dimension. The time had come to prepare a new prayer book. This is the end of 1548. We cannot be sure that the book was submitted to the 13 divines who 100 years later, 1662, were supposed to have drafted the first Book of Common Prayer in 1549. But it is certain that in September and October 1548, Cranmer presided over an assembly of bishops and divines who met at Windsor Castle and at Chertsey to examine a draft which Cranmer himself had prepared. Cranmer had for some years been engaged in a new liturgy. As early as 1538, and he had been in 1532 in various Lutheran cities and seen the Lutheran liturgy which impressed him and which would be a source for his revision of the Book of Common Prayer. He'd entertained Millet at Ford while Millet was drafting some liturgical project at Cromwell's instructions. But Cranmer's two great drafts of the liturgy date from 1543, which we were talking about with the Prebendaries plot 5 years earlier, when Convocation had decided to complete Henrician uniformity by abolishing small divergences between the 5 uses in the parts of England. There was the Sarum Missal, the York Missal, the Hereford Missal, the Devonshire. There were several of them with slight variations. There was nothing very radical about Cranmer's first draft. It was based on the Reformed breviary of the Spanish Cardinal Quignon, which he had produced for Pope Paul III in 1535. But Cranmer was more conservative than Quignon's work and differed less from the old Sarum use, and that's what he was raised on. The whole service was to be in Latin. Cranmer probably drafted this document in the reactionary days of 1543, but it was not adopted, and a year or so later, it was easier to put forward more revolutionary proposals. It was probably about 1545 that Cranmer drafted his second liturgy. In this draft, the 8 traditional hours, and that's how they prayed in the monastery. They had 8 periods through the day, and it was so complex to find your way, say, through the Sarum Missal, which Cranmer objected to the difficulty. He spent more time trying to figure out how to do the service than understanding the contents of it. It was a project that, just like a bureaucracy, grows and grows and grows. Maintaining the splendid fiction that the devout Englishman went to church 8 times a day. Not so. That was the monasteries. And they were replaced, those 8 services, by morning and evening prayer. The Lord's Prayer and some other parts of the service were to be in English, and the traditional Sarum calendar of saint days, by which everyone regulated their lives and their calendars and dated their letters, was to be replaced by a new calendar of Cranmer's invention, in which biblical personages from the Old Testament were commemorated, along with many obscure martyrs and characters of post-biblical legends. Cranmer abandoned both these drafts in the autumn of 1548 and produced a third for examination by his brethren at Windsor Castle and Chertsey. This, too, was based on Quiniona, on Cranmer's earlier drafts, and on the old Greek liturgies, and even apparently at one point on the Mozambique ritual of ancient Spain, as well as the Sarum use. But it also showed an unmistakable connection with Luther's liturgies, and the communion service was concerned throughout with eliminating as far as possible the idea of the propitiatory Mass as a sacrifice. The offertory and accompanying prayers, during which the people gave money to purchase bread and wine, which contained the words relating to the sacrifice, were replaced by a collection for alms for the poor. In the canon, the prayers before consecration were changed to omit all reference to sacrifice. After the words of consecration, there was no longer mention of the sacrifices of Abel, Abraham, and Melchizedek. And now it was their prayers, no longer the elements on the altar, which the people prayed should be carried on high. All of this was very Lutheran, but there were a few points in which the eager searcher could perhaps detect signs of something else. The words of consecration in the Sarum use prayed that the elements may be made into the body and blood of the most dearly beloved Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Cranmer changed this to a prayer that the elements may be unto us the body and blood of the most dearly beloved Jesus Christ. The omission of the word was thought to be very significant, as was the suppression of the elevation of the host. That made a comeback in Anglicanism, not in Cranmer's day. The order for communion had forbidden elevation during the communion service, but now it was prohibited in the Mass itself at the moment of consecration. Yet it seems clear that the popular indignation against the Book of Common Prayer was not caused by any of these changes, but by the provision that the whole Mass was to be said in English instead of in Latin. Cranmer had told Queen Mary that the divines who examined the draft of the Book of Common Prayer were unanimous in approving the proposal that the Mass should be in English. If this is true, and it is confirmed by Bishop Ridley, it shows that the Orthodox bishops and divines were prepared to give way on this point in order to fight other essential matters. But to the ordinary Englishman, this question of language was the most essential point of all. He did not notice if the word maid was left out of the canon, but he knew that his Latin Mass had been abolished. His indignation perhaps caused by the fact that he did not wish to have the mystery of the Latin Mass replaced by a service in language which he could understand, and which therefore required a more active mental participation on his part. But whatever the reason, the alteration in the language of the Mass outraged all the conservative instincts of the people. Cranmer's draft did not meet with unanimous approval of the commissioners at Windsor and Chertsey, as was falsely claimed in the recitals of the Act of Uniformity. Thurlby opposed all the innovations, particularly the elevation of the host, its abolition. Eventually, all the commissioners seemed to have accepted the draft except Bishop Day, who refused to agree chiefly because of the omission of references to oblation and the deletion of the words "may be made unto us" from the canon. But the opposition was to no avail, for the nobility had turned to Zwinglian. When the proposed prayer book was the subject of disputation in the House of Lords in the middle of December, Cranmer and the reforming bishops came out with a public repudiation of the real presence. The issue in disputation was whether the bread remained in the sacrament after consecration. Cranmer, Ridley, Holbeach, and Goodrich, supported by the able, if untheological, advocacy of Sir Thomas Smith, Secretary of State, asserted, against the arguments of Heath, Day, Reps, and Tunstall, that the bread remained bread. But Cranmer did not limit himself to a denial of transubstantiation, which was the only question actually in dispute. He was not as lucid and outspoken as Ridley, but he stated his position unequivocally. He asserted that evil men did not receive the body when they ate the bread, but Christ is in heaven, not in the bread and in wine, that the bread was a sign of the body, and the bread and wine are not changed outwardly but inwardly. This change is inward, not in the bread, but in the receiver. Christ is in the world by his divinity, but not in his humanity. The property of his Godhead is everywhere, but his manhood is in one place only. Bonner intervened to state roundly that the new prayer book contained the same heresy which had been condemned in Lambert's case of 1538, and he was right, because the last rubric of the communion service referred to the sacrament of the bread and the sacrament of the wine. Even now, the government was prepared to make concessions, and the passage was altered, perhaps at Cranmer's suggestion, to read sacrament of the body and sacrament of the blood. This was quite reconcilable with the manner in which Cranmer interpreted his doctrine of the presence. In Parliament, the Act of Uniformity was carried against the votes of the Orthodox bishops in the House of Lords, as was the bill permitting priests to marry. But the resistance of the bishops encouraged resistance up and down the country, which had already led to riots and executions when images had been suppressed the previous year. A very dangerous situation was developing, and the people were saying that at this time the emperor's armies came. This is late 1548 going into 1549. Yet Cranmer seems to have been taken by surprise by the extent of the opposition of the bishops in Parliament. Peter Martyr wrote to Martin Bucer at Christmas 1548 that no one had expected this, and as Martyr had spent a great deal of time with Cranmer in the previous year, it was obvious Cranmer had not expected it. Cranmer presumably still hoped, with all his concessions and usual moderation, to win over men of goodwill, if not obstinate malefactors like Stephen Gardiner. In Cranmer's eyes, his Book of Common Prayer merely purged the services of innovations which had crept in during recent centuries and returned to the old practices of the primitive church, while the translation of the Mass into the vernacular enabled the people to understand its meaning. But Cranmer was now encountering outraged conservatism in all its fury, and it will end up with a Devonshire uprising in 1549 as the story continues. We'll bring this to an end. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and always will be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed. Good to have you here in our Cranmer readings. That's late 1548 into 1549. And in the other reading with McCulloch, we were on the events of March, April 1543. So we're trying to get two different time periods. And that 1543 is a dynamic story in itself. And now we're going into 1549 with more challenges facing the evangelical reformers. Godspeed.